discuss our approaches and any specific technical questions that you might have. And this will be a relatively lightly technical session. We are going to get into a few things around things like identifiers and verifiable credentials. So if you bear with us while you do that if you happen to be non-technical. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of the proprietary data trust framework, a bit about the framework itself. We'll talk about a really key part of it, which is the way that the framework represents provenance alongside the data. Some of our thinking around what the limitations are, what we've done so far, and how we're going to evolve the framework to handle that. A really quick look at a deployment case study that's just in the public domain. A bit of a chat about next steps, and then we can open it up to a more general forum for questions or feedback or conversation. And the idea is we're going to have these on a quarterly basis now. We'll give you a little readout if we make progress between quarterly sessions in terms of actions that we're taking or developments that we're making to keep everyone up to speed, and then we can regroup on these quarterly sessions to take more broader group feedback if that's what we need to do. So hopefully that sounds good to everyone. Just the context of why we're doing this, and I really I guess we call it the property data trust framework, but really the use case that we are primarily focused on from a pragmatic point of view at the outset, at least to start off with, is the residential home transaction process, which you will all know is fraught and fragile. These numbers were from last year, but there was a fall through rate of 30% in terms of property residential sales. Average time from offer to completion 150 days, which is obviously ridiculous, and annual cost to the consumer in the industry in terms of wasted fees and time of potentially £1 billion. And there are lots of reasons why property sales fall through and lots of reasons why there are delays, but many of them are related to data that is not flowing around the process. And in particular, we're keen on these attributes of data where they should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, or FAIR, as it's known. And that is not the case with the way that the data flows around the typical home residential transaction. And so as a result, this isn't a flow diagram of how it works, but it is a diagram of sometimes how it feels to people. There's a very much an opacity around the transaction, things going backwards and forwards. People are being chased up all the time to supply data, and nobody really knows what's going on, and things can fall apart for reasons for which they shouldn't. So that's one of the reasons why we developed the property data trust framework, and the work for this started, I guess, maybe 3 years ago, on some very simple initial steps in producing a vocabulary, a JSON schema of some of the data that was represented in the transaction, and has since grown to encompass quite a lot more than that. The idea is that the framework sits at the center of all of these participants in the transaction, but really with the buyer and the seller at the top and the bottom of this diagram particularly in mind, but in a way that's able to support all the other participants in the transaction and streamline that process as much as possible. And it is very much aligned with the way everyone is starting to think about how property should be bought and sold digitally. This is a slide from Land Registry Strategy back in 2022, which talks about exactly this. And I guess what we're trying to do is develop collaboratively across the whole industry the standards that are going to underpin the ability to do this digitally. It's certainly something that is needed. We don't see other initiatives able to achieve the same aims, and in particular, we don't see proprietary platforms, of which there have been several developed over time. We don't see those as the solutions to these problems. They've never managed to succeed, primarily because they are, I think, proprietary, and that's not, we think, the way forward. So our principles really are to be consumer-centric. Clearly, there are a whole range of participants to satisfy, and some of them have rightly so very high standards in terms of the trust that they place in the data. But the consumer should be in control. It should be built on open standards. I'll talk more about that in a second. Clearly, the data needs to be trusted, and it also needs to be able to evolve over time to cover the full conveyancing use case from end to end, and then we can start to take a look at more more expansive use cases wider than just conveyancing in the property sphere. Standards is a really key part of it, and as something even as boring and prosaic as a 3-pin plug, but that there are standards in relation to how you build them and how you build sockets to plug them into, obviously is what underpins the entirety of the electrical appliance industry here in the UK. If every electricity supplier and every appliance manufacturer had their own standards for how these things should work, then things would look very different. And of course, it's not just plugs and sockets, but all the technology that we have around the internet in particular are built on standards. And if we can get the property data trust framework to the same sort of recognition and level as people have of the little padlock that appears in their browser bar when they're connected securely to a website, then that's the sort of ambition that we have for the data trust framework, open standards underpinning all of that. In reality, the picture's a bit different just now. This is typically a data exchange format where data is passed between lawyers. It's a TA6 form that's been filled out probably late on a Friday night in crayon. And actually, as a data transmission format, it does have some merits. At least it has standardized representations of pieces of data, a bit harder to interpret than you would like, certainly up until recently nearly impossible, but at least there's a place for everything and people understand what they're getting. And so that's why many of the standards that we bring into the property data trust framework are based on these recognized data structures, so that we can replicate the kinds of experiences that people are currently using to gather data. Not terrible, just not very shareable. Replicate that process to some extent, but in a data form rather than a documents form. That, I guess, what underpins a lot of our thinking around this framework is that the best way that you can transmit information around is as data and not documents. The scope of what it is we're doing currently is represented by the dark orange boxes on this slide. So you can see we think about the scope of what we're doing as being, loosely speaking, a digital property pack, where you're representing the participants of that transaction, their role, contact details, their ID status. To some extent, material facts. This has obviously become much more important in the last 6 to 9 months with the release of trading standards guidance on upfront material information. And that includes a whole range of issues that are required now to be present in the listing of the property at the point it's marketed. Broader legal information, loosely represented by things like the Law Society TA6 and TA7 and TA10 forms, and also elements of the property pack like the title deeds and associated documents, the energy performance certificate, and searches of various kinds. And the items in the grey at the bottom are really areas of interest for us, where we're moving towards the representation of these so that we can encompass more and more parts of the end-to-end conveyancing journey over time. And that's what we've focused a lot on, spending time on building out our schema to support. Now, all of the schema is just really representations of data. The different ways that different parts of the industry like to see that data, and in particular being able to represent something that looks like a TA6 and has the same information requirements as a TA6 is important. We need to be able to render these forms, validate that they are complete, and gather the data for them. And so we use concepts called overlays, where we have our core schema, our core vocabulary structure of data, and we have these overlays which are able to represent different aspects of the requirements of different sorts of forms and other data structures to be able to handle that. So we're trying to cover both bases, really, a very broad representation of all the different kinds of data you could think about in relation to the conveyancing transaction, but also the ability to reflect different views of that to meet the various requirements of participants around the industry. So I think perhaps the single most important part of the way the property data trust framework is different from historically how data has been passed around through various kinds of platform integrations is the way that provenance is representable in the framework alongside the data. And it's super important because effectively, as soon as data leaves somebody's hands and passes into somebody else's hands, if it doesn't have provenance attached to it, arguably it may as well just be random data, because you have no idea where it came from really, and whether you can trust it. So it's very, very important. And the way that we analogize this really is thinking about Christmas trees. And to be fair, this analogy does work better at some times of the year than others. But if you just bear with me, if you think about the branches of the Christmas tree, the bare branches, as being our bare structure of data, our schema, if you like. And in fact, it has a very much a tree-like structure. If you looked at the schema, you could place data at any of that part of that tree if you happen to have the data. So, for example, if you had an energy performance certificate, then you go down the material facts branch and you go to energy efficiency bit and you get to current energy efficiency rating. And if you've got a piece of data that represents that, then you would put a little bauble there. In this case, we're saying the EPC rating is A. And so really what you have when you are decorating this tree, the data that you have is really a kind of tree decoration kit. It's a set of baubles with data on, a place where you know you can put it. And also, importantly, each bauble has a little label on it so that you can represent where it came from. So you might have two baubles that are obtained over different periods of time, which come from very different places, and you might place different amounts of trust in each one. And it may well be that one arrived later and has replaced the other. But because you're passing around these tree decoration kits, you can always recreate the current state of the tree, the current state of the data as you know it now, but also recreate it at any given point in time and trace any particular piece of information back through its entire history, being able to verify where it came from over that period of time as well. So that's the key thing. We pass around in the framework tree decoration kits and not decorated trees. Within the context of the label that is applied to each one, I guess we have this sort of hierarchy of levels of provenance, and you could argue that the way people pass data around at the moment has level 0. It is basically it's completely unprovenanced. But starting at the bottom of where our scale starts is the vouch, which is something somebody says. And clearly that's not necessarily the best you can do in relation to energy efficiency, but in relation to other kinds of data, for example, to the best of your knowledge, is there Japanese knotweed at the property, or are there any disputes with the neighbours? Often the best thing you can do is go on what the seller says. And importantly, if it's vouched for, then at least we know who said it and when they said it, and we can importantly point the finger if it came down to that. The next level up, I guess, would be if you could verify the identity of that person, then you probably have more trust in what they're saying and more reliance that you might be able to place on it. If they have some evidence to support the vouch that they've made, so it might well be, in this case, a printout of an EPC certificate or something, some other document, then that's clearly better than having nothing at all. But in that case, I suppose to be able to verify that data, you'd have to do so manually by actually looking at the certificate to verify that it did match, and obviously that takes effort. If you get an electronic record for that data, well, arguably that may not be that great depending on where you got it from. But could well be better than a vouch, and it's more likely to come from a trusted primary source. And I guess the gold standard would be if you could verify that it came from a trusted source and that it hadn't been tampered with in the meantime, then you've got something that which you can really hang your hat on in terms of being able to trust that data. And really, those levels of provenance are what are currently possible to represent within the Property Data Trust Framework. Every piece of data is wrapped up in its provenance, and we have various different kinds of vouchers or electronic records that come from various different sources that allow us to demonstrate and track the history of the data over time. So it's pretty powerful and super useful as a way of being able to represent this kind of information. And that's working in practice at the moment. There are live transactions going through using the Property Data Trust Framework for that purpose, but we are very conscious that there are limitations to our current approach that we do want to address. And I think as we start to think about use cases, especially in relation to financial elements of the transaction, and being able for conveyancers to place real reliance on data, so not to have to refetch it or revalidate it themselves, then there are a bunch of things that we do know we need to work on. And as we get more scale, as we get more adoption around the industry, these are things that will become more and more important for us to have a good answer to. So among the limitations that we have, for example, are we have a very large schema that's all in one place. It has over 40,000 lines of code in it at the moment, over 4,000 different pieces of data, and every piece of transactional attribute is all bundled all together there. So it's relatively unwieldy. I'll talk about how we might split that up in just a second. We don't have an inbuilt permissions model. So although data is being shared around, we rely on everybody who has the data and data is being shared with to enforce any kinds of controls in relation to who should or shouldn't see the data. Now, clearly, some of it is of absolutely a public nature. It's publicly available information. It's literally on the property listing, but many times that data is at least slightly confidential in nature, if not very sensitive in nature. So we can't really support sensitive use cases using the mechanisms that we have at the moment. And the key one in that case is around digital identity, in particular in relation to anti-money laundering. Because really we don't have any unified identifiers, it's very hard to centralize on identification that is shared between different parties in the transaction, and that has implications on the level of security we can achieve, which I'll talk about more in a second as well. And also, it's not actually possible within the way that we do things at the moment to truly verify the content or the source of claims. So even for electronic records, providers of this data are making assertions about where it came from that you just have to trust at face value, and that's obviously not ideal for critical and sensitive use cases. So the way we're moving forward on some of this is to move from where we are at the moment using a standard called OpenID Connect Verified Claims towards another standard, which does sound very similar, admittedly, but it's called W3C Verifiable Credentials. And as you can see from this diagram, you can see the benefits of various different kinds of provenance in this context, where plain data really has no ability to be provenance at all. And we're trying to get to this point where we can support fully all the different kinds of provenance that we want to be able to represent within the contents of the transaction. And a verifiable credential isn't anything particularly magical. It's just really a data structure in itself. It has a lot in common with our existing verified claims model. And what it has is really every single piece of data has a subject of that data, one or more claims. So if you like, the baubles that we put on our Christmas tree, some evidence, which may be a manual link to a piece of source evidence. It may be an attachment that could be verified in a manual way, but also really importantly, a cryptographic proof which effectively signs the verifiable credential to show that A, it came from the place where it said it came from, and also that it hasn't been tampered with in the meantime. So now we've got a way of digitally verifying the source of the data without having to go back to the originator to be able to do that. And verifiable credentials aren't actually a technology that's designed for property. They're really designed for more identity-based attributes. So, for example, one conception of that, and this is being done in various places around the world, obviously not in the DVLA in the UK at the moment, but conceptually, you would have a driving license issued as a verifiable credential that will be held potentially in a mobile wallet by a qualified driver. And then if a rental company wanted to verify that, importantly, they can do so without actually having to verify with the source, because they know what the identity of the DVLA should look like. They know how to verify digitally that the driving license has been signed by the DVLA, and they can take it at face value and they can trust it because it's part of the trust framework that is established around driving license potentially here in the UK. And really what we're saying is we can take all of those capabilities and qualities that relate to verifiable credentials and relate them instead to property credentials and also identity credentials, incidentally, to allow us to do a similar thing with trust around property data here in the UK. So in this case, a credential might well be some kind of proof of ownership of a property. We are some way away from that technically at the moment, but we can see that happening in the future, which somebody holds as a way of demonstrating that they have a legal ownership interest in the property, and they can send that to somebody like the buyer's conveyancer to demonstrate to them that they do, and the conveyancer can verify that without having to check directly with land registry in order to do so. And so you can see in relation to the issuer, holder, and verifier roles, if we look back at the diagram we originally had around all these participants around the transaction, various different times in the transaction, different members of this participant group are going to be issuers and verifiers and holders of these various different credentials over the course of time. And of course, when we think about what it is we're actually describing in relation to these credentials, it isn't just a single thing, which is a transaction. We're actually really thinking about property and person and title as being three different entities which are related during the course of a transaction. And the relations between those things are also representable by verifiable credentials. So we can imagine the relationship between an address and the title deeds that are being sold for that address is not always straightforward. So we need to model those relationships, and equally the relationship between a seller and their entitlement to sell a particular title is not always straightforward, particularly in the case of probate. And so we also need to be able to represent that. Importantly, we're also able to represent not just the entities themselves and the relationships here, but also the relationships between the participants and the transaction. So a conveyancer, for example, being instructed in the matter of the sale of this property can also be represented as a kind of relationship credential, and different participants in this graph will have different abilities to be able to represent these kinds of relationships. So we can build an entire picture of the way that the property, the people, and the titles all are interacting together to produce all the information we need to safely conduct the conveyancing of the property. Now, one of the things I mentioned earlier on about some of the limitations of what it is we do is in relation to identifiers, and this may get a little technical, so bear with me. But really importantly, we need to have standardized ways of talking about these entities so that when we are talking about a given property or a title or a person, in the context of the transaction, we know we're talking about the same thing. And without these kinds of identifiers, it becomes very difficult to understand that you are really talking about the same thing. So we use some, you'll recognize, for example, some of these URN schemes. Commonly we'll call them URLs, Uniform Resource Locators. You'll recognize them as being web addresses, but there are other kinds of ways of describing resources like these URN mechanisms, which are much more flexible, and we can create really namespaces of our own, which we'll see in a second. And importantly, one of the key elements that underpins the way we think about the future of the property data trust framework, and is really a key part of verifiable credentials, is this idea of decentralized identifiers. So we have a way really of creating these identifiers that importantly have within them the concept of cryptographic key pairs. So in other words, if you look at this identifier here, this did key identifier, this actually is a kind of representation of a public key, which forms a way of being able to both sign certain documents, and in particular, in this case, verifiable credentials, but also verify that you control that key. So that has implications for things like authorization. I'll come back to that in a second because it's kind of an important part of how this all hangs together. So turning to how we think about these entities and how we represent the credentials, we are doing this already in relation to attributes across the property, and this is really just narrowing this down to thinking about, what relates to a person or a property or a title. So in particular, in relation to the seller, in the way we propose things, then we can think about a decentralized identity for that seller, which is essentially really a representation of their the fact that they have an account in a particular system that they're using to interact with this transaction. In this case, a kind of fictional app called Mootopia, and so their ID, their DID here, is related to the existence of an account they have in that system. There's a range of information here which is absolutely person identifiable. It's literally their personal identity, which obviously has some sensitivity around it. And there are a couple of other things in terms of their claims around being authorized to sell the property and what their asking price is. And these are all already representable within the property data trust framework. Similarly, on the buyer side, you've got a similar sort of set of things. Again, they've established an account in a particular system, which is where we can anchor their decentralized identifier. They've got some PII there, and other attributes that they have asserted. But also in this case, there is an attribute which is actually not to be disclosed to them themselves, but it is only to be disclosed to other participants in the transaction. So there's a particular kind of confidentiality where the credential is in relation to them as a subject, but it isn't actually visible to them for AML reasons. Similarly, and I think this would be a good thing to do, would be to be verifying not just the buyer and seller transaction, but the conveyancers, the brokers, etc., around the transaction, given that there is a non-zero amount of fraud that goes along with people impersonating conveyancers and so on. So to be able to do that is a valuable thing to do. And then turning to the title, I guess what we're saying here is we can construct one of these uniform resource namespaces, which is just PDTF, so that we can uniformly relate a particular title to an identifier in a way that everyone can share and understand what it means. In this case, these credentials are just the credentials that are obtained from land registry, although not in the form that we would like, in relation to the address and the registered legal owners and the shape of the title, extents, and the existence of a charge. All of these are attributes that we would associate with a title. And then finally, with the property, and this constitutes really the bulk of what we address in our schema, is all the different aspects of the property that relate to the kinds of things you want to know as a buyer as to whether or not it's safe to buy that property. And obviously that the entire conveyancing process is related to ensuring that there isn't anything in here that would materially negatively impact a buyer, or at least if it did, in a way that they are comfortable with it doing. So quite a lot of attributes here in relation to the property itself. Now, one thing about using these decentralized identifiers, these DIDs, in the course of what we're doing, is that some of the limitations around what we have at the moment, so the inability to really relate a vouch that somebody makes to that person, and our inability to control access, these are solved by being able to use these DIDs to be able to do various different kinds of authentication. And it's a relatively technical thing which we can go into another time, but essentially, if we, for example, request a digital identity from, say, Third Port, but the subject of that identity is the DID that we're using in relation to the account that we have, and then we use that DID also to sign the vouchers that are made by that account holder, then we have a way of tracing back the vouchers that have been made back to a real natural person in a way that is verifiably linked to them and is not reputable by them. So quite a powerful way of doing that, and equally using DIDs in relation to other issuers of data, so land registry, Experian, etc., allows us to fully trace back that data to its source and be able to trust it fully. It also allows us to do the kind of access control that we had already said had been missing from the way that we currently do things. So if we remember back to this diagram where we're saying Mark McManus has been instructed as the seller's conveyancer, well, all we need to do, if Mark McManus wants to access the credentials that we are building around this transaction, all we need to do is to verify that Mark controls the private key that is associated with the DID under which he's been invited into the transaction, and we'll know for sure that it's Mark who is wanting to access these particular claims. So that builds us a very flexible way of being able to control access to the more sensitive parts of these credentials around the property, that is entirely related to our ability to associate real people with people who are invited into transaction, which is a pretty neat way of doing things. Another part of the specification that allows us to do important things is the terms of use properties within the specification. And this allows us to set a confidentiality level on the claims that we are producing, something between potentially public, restricted, confidential. We can ensure that only those people who have the required credentials, so in the previous case, perhaps Mark McManus, or perhaps anybody who is a qualified lawyer, should be able to see them, and also allows us to flag that there is personally identifiable information within the context of the claim. So you can imagine with an identity verification, for example, clearly that would be at the confidential level. It would have the PII flag set and be limiting its access to people who really needed to see it in the context of the transaction, and certainly not, for example, a buyer or another member of the public. So really, this approach gives us the ability to address many of the limitations that we have in the way that we're doing things currently. You know, we can break up our monolithic schema into something that makes much more sense and allow us to properly model the relationships between these entities. It allows us to use these terms of use to handle permissions in a very flexible way. We can have these stable identifiers, so everyone can be talking about the same entities when they are connecting these things together, and we can verify that those claims have demonstrated provenance and that they haven't been tampered with in the meantime. So lots of stuff there, which is really important for us to be able to do. Okay, I'm going to just a little bit talk very briefly about a deployment that's underway at the moment, and all this information is in the public domain. And I'm not going to talk about anything sensitive in relation to it, but it's a project that is just underway and about to go live, which is the Connell's Digital Cell Ready project. And this has participants from a bunch of different places who are all OPDA members. And one element of that is Movely, which is I also have a participation in as a company alongside my work with the OPDA, where effectively in one part of the transaction we're dealing with the agent and the seller to help them get their material information together. And to do that, we reach out to a whole variety of different data sources. It should be said that none of these, of course, are property data trust framework compliant in relation to the APIs that they expose, but our job and others are doing this work across the industry as well. Our job is to take those legacy sources, if you like, and turn them into data sources that do comply with the trust framework. So map them into the required schema and ultimately sign them ourselves on behalf of those sources. So make the property digital sale ready in conjunction with the agent and the seller. And this is the kind of thing that we're producing here to enable the agent to get a handle on material information and produce this digital sale ready pack. And then, importantly, using the property data trust framework, share that with LMS, who have their workspace product, to be able to then allow the seller's conveyancer to come in and review the materials. Ultimately, when the buyer's conveyancer is instructed, allow them to come in and do their important work around the diligence for the buyer. And as an extension of this, and hopefully for the near future, start to bring in lending use cases and get towards the point where we can effectively conduct an entire transaction in the context of all of these systems talking together using the PDTF to ensure that we have a common language to be able to share this data around and replicate data backwards and forwards between systems. So early days for us. There are other products available, of course, and other people doing really great work using the property data trust framework elsewhere in the industry. But just wanted to flag something that is current, is going live just at the moment, and we're obviously hopeful that it gets a pretty broad adoption across the Commons Group and other agency groups around the country as well over time. Very exciting project to be part of. Right, just a quick look at next steps, and then we'll sort of wrap up this presentation part of the morning. There is a lot of work to do. All the collaborators that we work alongside from Cojute and Catini and others are working voluntarily to evolve our specs going forward, and talking about how we're going to take the property data trust framework into its next iteration. But the work continues apace, and we are working hard on evolving these ideas that we have around verifiable credentials into what will be a formal specification for a verifiable credential based version 2 of the PDTF. It's likely that the schema itself will be unchanged, which is quite important because we don't want to introduce breaking changes in the language that we're using, but certainly the way we represent credentials and the way we exchange them will evolve. We'll want to continue to extend our schema to involve increasingly lending use cases, and we've got some interesting proofs of concept going on there at the moment between, in particular, ourselves, Movely, and also OMS on the mortgage broking side. But also thinking about the day-to-day nitty-gritty of the transaction, inquiries and milestones, as being a standardized representation that we can share between different systems in a useful way. We're really keen to take input from the OPDA membership. Obviously, we're seeing quite a big growth in that membership, some very big names in banking and other parts of the lending ecosystem, as well as conveyancing and the upfront material information part of the industry coming on board now with that. Really exciting to see that. We want to work on expanding the scope of schema with all of those members. The thing that generally works best for us is just to shamelessly steal existing schemas and incorporate them into our schema. So anybody who's got existing data structures, and in particular, if you're working in relation to lending and surveys, I'm really interested to talk to you guys. And clearly to expand the scope and scale of our existing deployments as we start to grow the adoption of the property trust framework and bring people more into the fold. All right, that's 40 minutes of me talking at you